Yeah, we're going to continue talking about inequalities. So, yesterday we talked about the absolute value ones. I don't know why I can't spell today. Qualities. There we go. All right. Yesterday we talked about the absolute value ones. Today we have to talk about, you already know how to solve inequalities, but here's the one thing we've never talked about, is how to actually solve them graphically. Okay? So that's what I want to kind of discuss with you. It's going to make total sense once we do it. So when we talk about graphically today, let's say I have, I don't know, let's go with x squared minus 4 is less than or equal to 0. Okay? If I were to graph this, this is just a parabola that has moved down 4 spots, right? Okay, and of course it crosses at both 2 and negative 2, because if I were to factor that, does everybody agree so far? So here's our parabola. I was supposed to go through 2. We're going to pretend it did. All right. Now, looking at this picture, where it is, if I wanted to know where it was greater than, or less than, or even equal to is where it crosses, right? If it is less than 0, it is where it's below the x-axis. So in this case, below the x-axis, it simply goes from negative 2 to 2. If I wanted to do x squared minus 4 is greater than or equal to 0, then above the x-axis, put that in a different color, let's go with, above the x-axis is all of this area. Graphically. So if I were to write the interval where it's greater than 0, it would be from negative infinity to negative 2. And again, because it's got the equals underneath here, I'm going to make it a bracket. Put a u in the middle, a bracket, 2 to infinity. Okay, so when you're looking at it graphically, it's where it's below the x-axis or where it's above the x-axis. Okay? Do I need to clarify that? I mean, does that make sense, right? Okay, so let me put another drawing up here and see if we can't figure out the different intervals for what we're looking for. Okay, so let's say we have a cubic function. All right, so I'm going to put a cubic function, which means I'm going to have 2 terms on this thing. Let's go with something that looks like this. Okay, and let's call this point negative 4. Let's call this point negative 1. And let's call this point 3. All right, so let's start with where it is less than 0. So I want to talk about where the different intervals would be impacted. So less than 0 is where this is below the x-axis. So to the left, see how the arrow is below, this is all less than. And then we have that valley right below the x-axis. This is all less than. So how do you think we can write this interval? Okay, now it is just less than, so I'm going to make it a parenthesis, but I agree. And then what? Good. Negative 1 to 3. Completely agree. That's where it's below. Now, if it was less than or equal to 0, we would make negative infinity to negative 4 with a bracket. And, of course, it would be a bracket here as well to 3 with a bracket. That is the only difference, having that line underneath. Okay, I'm going to move that up a little bit. So then if I want to switch it and go greater than 0, Good, and 3 to infinity. Okay, because if you look at this, we'll use blue this time, it is this section where it's above and this section. Okay? And so then, of course, if it's greater than or equal to 0, it would be a bracket, -4 to -1, the bracket, and a bracket 3 to infinity. We've never really talked about it that way. We've never talked about it graphically. We've done it algebraically, but we've never done it this way. So then, let's try and do an example now that we understand what we're doing. Here is our example number 1 today. And this is the 17 through 20, actually 29. 17 through 29, so this is the second part. And then I'll go back and talk about it a little more. All right, so let's do one out of here. So let's go with how about, let's go 4x squared minus 12x plus 7 is less than 0. All right, so I want everybody to grab their graphic calculator. Make sure your window should be at -10 to 10 and -10 to 10, right? That's the basic window we start with. Okay, going into y equals. All right. Trying to figure out, somebody put my calculator in a funky mode. Not even sure where. Let's try this. There we go. All right, so when we graph this, we have a graph that kind of comes down like this, right? So we're going to need to know where it crosses the x-axis. We need to know what these 2 points are before we can decide what is less than 0. Okay, so we're going to do second, trace, down to our 0. And again, remember in AP, we got to go out to 3 decimal places. All right? So who found the first one for me? All right, so this one is 0.792. Okay, what's this one? 2.207, thank you. All right, so now if we want to know where is it less than 0, it's below the x-axis, and it's just less than, so we're going to use parentheses, and our answer is 0.792 to 2.207, parentheses. Okay, so a lot of today is doing graphing ones. All right, do we have any question regarding graphing? Not bad at all, right? Do me a favor and at least sketch it on your paper so that if for some reason you don't have the right answers, I know why. Do you know what I mean? So when you put in your calculator, just sketch it for me so I know what you got going on. Okay? All right, last thing I want to talk about then, let's talk about this if it was algebraic. Okay? So if I am solving something that's quadratic that is algebraic. So for example, let's say, here's example number 2. I have 4x squared minus 1 is greater than or equal to 0. All right, if I was going to solve this, we can solve this by factoring that, if you want to factor it. We can solve it by the quadratic formula. We can solve it technically by the square root method. We can find our two zeros, right? Which way do you guys want to do it? Not graphically. We're going to do it algebraically. So how do you want to solve it using our algebra skills? Factor it? Okay. So this is the difference of squares. This is the difference of squares. So we can straight factor it if you know the difference of squares. So this would be 2x plus 1 and 2x minus 1. Right? Does everybody agree with that? Okay. Then our zeros, where it actually crosses at, I would take this 2x plus 1, set that equal to 0. So I get x equals negative 1/2. And then this one, I would take that, set that equal to 0, and I get x equals positive 1/2. All right, now, that's technically your zeros. We're going to do what we call a sign table. This sign table is going to help us decide where it is greater than or equal to 0. So in a sign table, we draw a line, we put a mark at negative 1/2, and we put a mark at positive 1/2. Okay. Now, I'm going to pick a number smaller than negative 1/2. So like negative 1. All right? And I'm going to plug it back into here. So I put negative 1 in here. I get 2 times negative 1 is negative 2, plus 1, negative, right? This is negative. If I put negative 1 in here, I get 2 times negative 1, negative 2 minus 1. It's also negative. So I get a negative times a negative, right? So what do I actually get for this if I put a negative number in there? Okay, so all I'm going to do in my signs table is say it's going to be positive there. Okay? Now, I need to pick a number between negative 1/2 and 1/2. What's the easiest number that falls between there? 0. So if I put 0 in here, in the first parenthesis I have a positive 1. My second parenthesis I have a negative 1. If I multiply those together, I'm going to get a negative number, right? So in my signs table, just above that section, I'm going to say it's negative. Okay? Then if I pick something bigger than 1/2, so I put a 1 in here, I'm going to get a positive answer here. I'm going to get a positive answer here. So that means that a positive times a positive is a positive, right? So this is going to be positive. Now, looking at the signs table we have, where is this greater than 0? At either side, exactly. So since, whoops, let me go a little bit down. Since we're going a little bit or greater than or equal to 0, it's to this side, so negative infinity to negative 1/2. And because it does have the equals, I'm going to put a bracket. And then I have a bracket at 1/2 to infinity. Okay? I'm going to try one more, and I'm going to let you guys do your homework. I'm going to do it algebraically again. So let's do example number 3. Solve algebraically. And I'll do a little bit harder one because then the ones you have in your homework are going to be easier. All right. Let's go with, how about x to the third minus x squared minus 30x. And let's do where it is less than 0. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is factor this, right? What is my greatest common factor I can take out? Okay, so I have x times x squared minus x minus 30. Okay? Then I'm going to draw my x, negative 30 on top, negative 1 on the bottom. Good, negative 6 and 5. So my factors are x minus 6 and x plus 5. All right, so now I have 3 zeros, don't I? I have a 0 at x, right? So x equals 0. I have a 0 right here at 6. And what 0 do I get for this one? Good. All right. So my signs table. Make sure you put those numbers in the right order. So which number out of those 3 goes all the way to the left? Good. Then we have 0, and then we have 6. All right. So now I'm going to pick a number that is smaller than negative 5. Okay, so I'm going to put a negative 6 in here. So I have negative 6, right? So that's a negative. Maybe put a little dash here. It's a negative for the first factor. If I put a negative 6 in here, I get a negative for the second factor, and I get a negative for the third factor, don't I? So I actually end up with negative times a negative times a negative is negative. So this section's negative. That's one of them I need, right? If I pick something between negative 5 and 0, negative 1. So I get a negative for the first factor. If I put a negative in here, I get negative 1 minus 6, negative 7. But if I put a negative in here, I get a positive. So now what do I get for those three factors? Positive, exactly. How about between 0 and 6? Let's use just positive 1. So I have a positive. What do I get for 1 minus 6? I get a negative. And then 1 plus 5, I get a positive. So that section is also going to be positive times a negative times a negative. There we go. And the last section, if I plug 10 in there, it's all going to be positives. So it'll be positive. All right. So now answering my question. What intervals are less than 0? First one is here, which is negative infinity to negative 5. And it's a parenthesis this time because it's just less than 0. And then my next interval goes from 0 to 6. Very good. Okay? Questions at all? These signs table, I want you to get used to them because we're going to be using them throughout the year. That's why I wanted to start them when it's easy stuff. Okay? Good? Good? All right. 1 through 29 odd, and you have like 25 minutes.